Welcome. We're here to unpack some really compelling sources, give you a clearer picture of the world. And for today's dive, we're cracking open a book that's definitely insightful, sometimes pretty challenging. Let Them Eat Tweets: How the Right Rules in an Age of Extreme Inequality. It's by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pierson. Now, you hear that title, Let Them Eat Tweets, and you might think it's all about Trump. But Hacker and Pierson are actually pretty clear this isn't just about him. Their core argument really is about a huge shift, something happening over decades in American politics that, well, they argue it paved the way for figures like Trump. They really dig into how extreme inequality has just soared and, crucially, how the Republican Party, in their view, has navigated that whole landscape.
Yeah, what's really interesting is how they frame it. It's this immense shift that happened before Trump came along. They basically argue he reinforced things already there in the party rather than really challenging its core directions.
Okay, so Hacker and Pearson's central claim is pretty stark. They argue that American politics since about 1980 has been defined by the rise of plutocracy. They suggest it's a system where the wealthy elite systematically shape and use political power, often kind of behind the scenes. And they've got the numbers. They point out over the last 40 years or so, the wealthiest Americans, big corporations, financial interests, they've gathered wealth on a scale that's just, well, unimaginable to earlier generations. In fact, they say the richest 0.1%, just the very top, now have roughly as much wealth as the entire bottom 90% combined.
And stepping back, the author's big insight here isn't just, wow, that's a lot of money. They argue that this huge concentration of wealth and all the influence that comes with it has been used strategically, used to build political organizations. And these organizations, Hacker and Pierson contend, push for goals that are often really at odds with what most Americans might want or need. What really stands out in their analysis is how this influence specifically shapes policy, pushing agendas that, mostly benefit the select few.
And the Republican Party's shift, according to Hacker and Pierson, has been just as dramatic. They make the case that the party became laser-focused on one thing: tax cuts. Tax cuts for corporations, tax cuts for the super rich, often leading to massive deficits. The authors argue this meant basically abandoning any traditional conservative idea about fiscal restraint, except when it came to attacking social programs.
Right, things like Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, popular program.
Exactly. And they also document this push against environmental rules, consumer protections, labor rights, financial regulations. And maybe most telling, they point to the appointment of judges to federal courts who are consistently pro-business and anti-labor.
And they make the point that all this happened even without broad public support.
Which brings us to this really key idea they explore, drawing on the work of Daniel Ziblatt. It's called the conservative dilemma. It's this basic challenge, right? If you're a conservative party in a democracy, how do you win elections, get mass support,
while still staying close to your traditional base of economic elites? It's a balancing act.
A really tricky one historically, and the authors show it's something conservative parties have struggled with everywhere.
So this raises a really interesting comparative question. How have other parties handled this dilemma? The book gives a couple of fascinating examples. They look at the British Tories, for instance, who they argue mostly adapted democratically. They leaned into nationalism, tradition, but they also made concessions on economic stuff when they had to keep voters on board.
Okay, so they bent a bit.
Yeah, they bent. But then you look at German conservatives, according to Hacker and Pierson's reading of history, they argue that German conservatives largely failed to adapt democratically. They remained kind of disdainful of democracy itself, and they ended up resorting to more anti-democratic tactics, rigging elections, partnering with extremist groups, that kind of thing.
Quite a contrast.
It is. The authors suggest that these German elites never really got comfortable with a fully democratic system. And the point Hacker and Pierson want us to see is this stark choice conservative parties face. Adapt democratically, or you risk going down a much darker anti-democratic path. And then, of course, they turn to how the American Republican Party in their analysis chose this path.
Okay, so given that economic shift and this conservative dilemma, how did the Republican Party actually start putting this embrace of plutocracy into action? The authors trace it through two main stages. The first one, centered in Congress, kicked off around 1994. Newt Gingrich is the key figure here. They argue Gingrich reshaped the party into this powerful tool for plutocratic goals, mainly by stoking voter outrage.
Right, that partisan combat style.
Exactly. Name-calling, conspiracy theories, blocking things strategically. Pioneered that playbook within the party mainstream. And they use a really telling example from 1990. George H.W. Bush agreed to some tax increases specifically aimed at the super rich.
Which wasn't actually that unpopular with voters overall.
No. But according to Hacker and Pierson, Gingrich and his allies just revolted. They basically vowed to take down any Republican who supported any new taxes.
And figures like Tom DeLay the Hammer, they call him.
Right. And Grover Norquist.
Yeah, these guys became the enforcers. They made sure everyone stayed in line with this anti-tax, pro-plutocrat agenda.
Using their influence with lobbyists, with donors.
And one key takeaway Hacker and Pierson stress is just how sustained this shift was. It wasn't overnight. They see it as this decades-long, very deliberate move by the Republican Party towards these hard-right economic priorities. Even, as they point out, when it sometimes meant pushing away more traditional voters or moderate party members who might not have benefited from those policies, the consistency is pretty remarkable when they lay it all out.
Okay, so this long-term strategy leads us to what the authors call the 3 R's of Republican base building: resentment, racialization, and rigging. Let's take those one by one. Resentment. Hacker and Pierson argue the GOP got really good at tapping into white working-class discontent.
Yeah, drawing straight from Nixon's Southern Strategy playbook,
They mentioned that infamous 1981 interview with Lee Atwater.
where he basically laid out how to use abstract language to get at racial anxieties without sounding overtly racist.
Exactly. Atwater literally talked about making sure race was coming in on the back burner, even when the main topic was, say, tax cuts. Then the second R, racialization. The authors described this as moving from maybe more overt racism to using coded language.
So using terms that mean one thing on the surface, but carry a different, often racialized meaning for certain audiences.
They argue terms like entitlement or welfare got weaponized this way, used to stir up racial resentment, linking government programs, even popular ones like Social Security and Medicare, to quote-unquote freeloaders, who are often subconsciously associated with minorities.
It's a kind of rhetorical sleight of hand, as they put it.
And they use this specific anecdote that really highlights the strategic shift, particularly around social issues. It's about the Christian rights mobilization. Such a powerful force in the GOP.
Often associated with issues like abortion.
But Hacker and Pierson argue its big political activation wasn't initially about abortion at all. It was apparently triggered significantly by an IRS ruling back in 1978. The IRS threatened the tax-exempt status of segregated Christian schools.
Okay, so that was the spark.
That was a major spark, according to their analysis. It led to this really crucial alliance with the GOP and then a strategic shift towards focusing on social and cultural issues that could really energize that base. So mobilizing that base with social issues was key. But Hacker and Pierson argue securing power also involved changing the rules of the game, that's the third R, rigging the electoral system.
What kind of things fall under rigging, in their view?
Well, tactics like voter restrictions, think strict ID laws, making registration harder, cutting back on early voting days or locations, and of course gerrymandering, drawing electoral maps to favor one party.
The politicians picking their voters, not the other way around.
Exactly. They give this stark example from North Carolina where Republicans kept control of the state house, even though they lost the overall popular vote. Thanks, in large part, to maps drawn with the help of this gerrymandering expert, Thomas Hoffeller.
The guy who basically said redistricting is like an election in reverse.
That's the quote they use. Usually the voters get to pick the politicians. In redistricting, the politicians get to pick the voters. Chilling, really.
And the authors really probe this. They ask, how much does this kind of rigging weaken the votes of non-white citizens and, at the same time, boost the influence of white Republicans? Hacker and Pierson basically contend that almost every type of vote rigging the party uses is designed precisely to do that, to disproportionately hit minority and low-income voters while strengthening the party's core demographic as they see it.
Another big piece of the puzzle for Hacker and Pierson is what they call the outrage industry, the rise of right-wing media. They focus on platforms like AM talk radio, Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, obviously huge figures there, and then, of course, Fox News.
Creating this kind of closed-off media bubble.
They describe it as an insular media ecosystem, one that actively attacks traditional news sources, builds intense tribal loyalty, and essentially becomes this really powerful force shaping conservative thought and discourse.
And zooming out a bit, the bigger point Hacker and Pierson make is that this media environment didn't just, persuade voters. It fundamentally changed the Republican Party itself. They argue it acted like a disciplinary force. Politicians who stepped out of line, who didn't toe the hard right stance promoted by these outlets, they paid a price.
So the media wasn't just reporting on the party, it was shaping it.
What really strikes me is this quote they use from a former George W. Bush speechwriter.
Yeah.
He said Fox News went from seemingly working for Republicans
Mhm.
to a situation where Republicans were effectively working for Fox.
Wow. That really shows the power shift they're describing. Okay, so where does Donald Trump fit into this picture that Hacker and Pearson have painted? Well, they argue that despite all his populist talk, remember the promises not to cut Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, to take care of everybody on health care.
Yep.
But in practice, they argue he mostly just enabled the existing plutocratic agenda. His administration, as they document, quickly filled up with what they call a team of billionaires. People like Mnuchin at Treasury, DeVos at Education, Wilbur Ross at Commerce.
And he also appointed really hardline conservatives from the party's right flank to key posts too, didn't he?
Absolutely. And we saw specific examples, right? Like at the EPA. Scott Pruitt, then Andrew Wheeler, both, as the authors point out, had deep ties to the fossil fuel industry. And they led this massive rollback of environmental regulations, plus pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement.
And then there were the relentless efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act.
And to make cuts to Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security.
Even though, as the authors note, these moves were really unpopular with the public.
And would actually harm many of the very voters who supported Trump.
Hacker and Pierson argued that the refusal by Republican states to expand Medicaid, which they directly linked to thousands of preventable deaths, that tragically shows where the party's priorities lay, in their view. And beyond those administrative actions, maybe the biggest win for the plutocratic side, according to Hacker and Pierson, was reshaping the federal judiciary. They call it perhaps the most significant and durable victory for plutocrats.
With Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh going onto the Supreme Court.
Exactly, shifting the court firmly to the right. And the authors highlight the role of figures like Leonard Leo and organizations like the Federalist Society. They argue these groups were crucial in vetting and promoting judicial nominees who aligned with their agenda.
So the courts became a key strategic battleground.
A major strategic opportunity, as Hacker and Pierson put it. A way for economic elites, in their view, to lock in their preferences, often away from the public spotlight.
Okay, this leads us to the final big theme Hacker and Pierson explore. It's how structural features of the American political system itself enable what they call the tyranny of the wealthy and extreme minority.
So, features baked into the system.
First, our election system is based on territory, on geography, states, districts.
Which tends to disadvantage more densely populated urban areas where Democrats are stronger.
Exactly. The fact that every state gets 2 senators, regardless of population.
Right, so Wyoming has the same number of senators as California, but way, way fewer people.
Right. They say Wyoming gets something like 67 times more representation per person than California. This bias increasingly favors Republicans and overrepresents what they call white America. Third, there's the Electoral College. Its formula for allocating votes, senators plus representatives, also gives disproportionate weight to low population states.
Which is how we've seen presidents win the White House without winning the popular vote.
Twice in the 5 elections since 2000. And they project this trend will likely continue to favor Republicans going forward.
And the fourth feature.
The filibuster in the Senate. Its expanded use allows a minority of senators, just 41 out of 100, to block legislation favored by the majority.
A tool they say Republicans have been the main innovators in using, particularly in recent decades. They argue these features are being actively used, actively exploited. Well, they point to the Supreme Court again. Its conservative majority, they contend, plays a huge role by, for instance, weakening labor unions, making it harder to bring class action lawsuits.
Gutting the Voting Rights Act.
Right. And refusing to step in and limit partisan gerrymandering. All of these decisions, Hacker and Pierson argue, work together to strengthen this right-wing plutocratic alliance and make its power harder to challenge electorally.
And Hacker and Pierson point out our system, was designed with all these checks and balances, partly to prevent the tyranny of the majority, to make it hard for a simple majority to just run roughshod over everyone else.
Right, requiring broad agreement for major changes.
But they suggest it wasn't really designed to make it easy for a cohesive, powerful, and pretty extreme minority to control things.
Yet that's exactly what Hacker and Pierson argue twists the system's features to allow minority rule.
So what does all this mean for you? We've gone through Hacker and Pierson's argument, how extreme inequality, these strategic political shifts, the rise of the outrage industry, and exploiting these constitutional quirks have, in their view, profoundly changed American politics over the last few decades.
Yeah, it's a really complex story. It's about powerful interests adapting, unexpected alliances forming between economic elites on one hand and forces of cultural outrage on the other. The result is a political system that's become increasingly responsive to a wealthy and often extreme minority, frequently pushing policies that are at odds with what the broader public wants and sometimes even at odds with what the party's own voters say they prefer.
So you now have this powerful framework drawn from Hacker and Pierson's deep research to help understand these forces at play. It might help you cut through some of the noise, the day-to-day political drama, and see the underlying dynamics that, according to these authors, have really altered the political landscape. They suggest that while demographic changes might eventually challenge the current Republican coalition, the big question isn't just if change will come, but how. Will the political system somehow adapt towards a more inclusive future? Or will this tyranny of the minority, as they call it, find ways to dig in deeper, maybe using even more anti-democratic tactics?
It really makes you think, doesn't it? What signs will you be looking for as these tensions continue to play out in the years ahead?